I think we've already heard some great context for the next session, which is on regulating emerging technologies. We have a couple of speakers who'll be presenting papers now. The first of those is Lyria Bennett Moses, and then Roba Abbas will be speaking. So I'll ask Lyria to come up and introduce her paper. Thanks.
Okay, is that sort of the right volume? Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to be speaking about is regulating beyond nanotechnology, and the subtitle for the paper is Do Nano-Specific Problems Require Nano-Specific Solutions? So basically what I'm looking at is there are all these legal issues that arise with nanotechnology, and I'm going to go through some of them in the talk. My questions are not what are the legal problems, what laws need to change, but what form should law reform take? In other words, should we be thinking about regulating nanotechnology as such, or should we be thinking about it in terms of broader categories? So that's really where I'm going to be going with this talk. So when you get a new technology like nanotechnology, there's all these new things. There's new objects, if you like, nano devices and so forth. There's new activities that you can do, and so forth. And when you get those sort of new things coming along, there's this tendency to think, okay, what are the problems? We need to regulate them. In other words, to come up with specific solutions specifically tailored to the technology. And that's the idea I'm going to criticise. So starting out with nanotechnology, we've just had a talk really dealing with that. It's basically stuff at this sort of nano scale. So manufacture of nanomaterials with one dimension, but typically between 1 and 100 nanometers, or manipulation of materials on that scale. There are, however, when you actually look at the sort of scientific and policy documents around nanotechnology, lots of different definitions. In other words, the size range changes a bit. It's not always exactly the same. And also a lot of definitions have a functional component. So something in that context would only be a nanomaterial if not only it was of a particular size, but if it then had different properties or effects from the macro version of the material. So that size alone would not be enough to come within the definition. So there's a variety of ways in which this is defined. So what kinds of problems arise? Well, the Monash Centre for Regulatory Studies came up with 6, of which I'm really going to talk about 5. Legal problems in terms of how the law deals with nanotechnology. Now, there's a whole bunch of early literature that sort of got very excited about nanotechnology, about, what happens if this allows us to resurrect dead people and so forth, and what would be the implications of that. Mostly now, though, the concerns are more about what applications of nanotechnology are actually out there now and what are the problems with regulating those, rather than sort of futuristic conceptions of where things might go. And this is what the Monash Centre was looking at. So the first problem is that whenever you have a regulatory system for something like chemicals, okay, what you want to do is you want to regulate, you want to make sure that new things that come on the market are safe. So often these sort of regimes will treat differently, and I'm talking not just in Australia, but everywhere, will treat differently new chemicals and existing chemicals. So if you're manufacturing something that's already been manufactured and gone through safety testing before, you don't have to go through all the same safety tests again every time it's manufactured in a different place necessarily. Not that there's no regulation, just that it's less intense. Now the problem is that it makes certain assumptions about sameness. So if you've got a nano version of an existing chemical, is that the same as the existing chemical, or is it different? And that will depend on, how the legislation and so forth is drafted. But in a lot of cases, nano versions are treated as the same. So in other words, manufacturing a nano version of an existing chemical is regulated as if you're just manufacturing something that's already been done before. Now that's problematic because while nano versions might have the same molecular structure, for example, the size does affect its properties. Therefore, its toxicity, its risks, and so forth. So in the legislation that regulates it, it's not being regulated to a high enough standard because it's being regulated on the assumption that it's the same as something when in fact, due to its different properties, it's different. So that's the first nano problem, if you like. The second one is the idea that in a lot of cases, regulation of chemicals is based on mass and volume thresholds. So you might have greater regulation if you're manufacturing it in high volume, for example. Now, there's an assumption behind that too. The assumption is that it's not cost effective to regulate production of small volumes or small amounts of a chemical because the risk is correspondingly small. So you want to manufacture the big industrial plant, you don't necessarily want to subject a smaller operation to the same level of regulation because presumably manufacturing less makes it less risky. However, the problem again with nanomaterials is that they can be more reactive in small quantities. Okay, so a lot of regulation that has these thresholds don't even touch the manufacture of nanomaterials because the manufacture will generally be below the mass and volume thresholds. Nevertheless, there are still toxicity risks and so forth that are bigger than you might expect with normal molecular chemistry and so forth because they can be very reactive in small quantities. So that's the sort of second nano-specific problem discussed in the report. The third one is that most regulatory triggers in terms of when regulation kicks in and when you are and aren't allowed to do things, assume that the risk level is calculable and that this is known. So, for example, you can put restrictions on substances with known risks. You can put restrictions on substances from an alternative way unless the risk is known to be low. Right? You can put restrictions or you can require risks to be kept at a certain level. In other words, you can have occupational health and safety regulation, for example, that requires risks to be kept below a certain level. So, and there's a variety of laws that are framed in these sort of ways. Again, nanotechnology becomes a problem because, why? We don't know all of the risks. There's a lot more research to be done on how the risks work. It's not something we know. So if you're manufacturing or dealing in nanomaterials, it's unclear how these laws will operate, where there's an assumption the risk is known, or they might operate so as not to require regulation it would otherwise want. So where the regulation is only dealing with known risks, what happens if the risk is unknown and so forth? Okay. The next one that was discussed is risk assessment protocols, which is simply that the testing techniques used by industry and regulators may not be, the sort of toxicity testing that's done may not be sufficiently accurate for testing nanomaterials. So that's another sort of problem. It's just a problem of what risk assessment protocols there are and whether or not they're effective for nanomaterials. And the final one, number 5, is that, well, a lot of regulations, again, have research and development exceptions. So the regulation doesn't apply to manufacture in a research and development context or applies to a different extent. So if a lot of nanotech is still at the research stage, then a lot of these regulatory regimes won't apply because it'll come into the research and development exceptions. So that's sort of some of the problems. The Monash Centre was looking at Australian laws, but I think what I've tried to make clear is that it's about the way laws are generally framed, and the same problems have been demonstrated in US and Europe and so forth through other organisations that have looked at that. So why shouldn't we then think, if we've got all these problems, why shouldn't we think in terms of regulating nanotechnology as such, coming up with a Nanotechnology Act, for example, and thinking about how we want to deal with nanotechnology? Well, there's several problems with making solutions specific to nanotechnology, a Nanotechnology Act, for example. One is a sort of redundancy in creating multiple legal regimes. What you have a act regulating nanotechnology, an act regulating microtechnology, an act regulating a different kind of material science, an act regulating a different kind of medicine, and so forth. And you can end up with this sort of patchwork of different regimes. That's not only costly in the sense that you've got redundancy, the potential for separate bureaucracies, everyone needs to be aware of every single potential applicable legal regime, interpretive issues come up in multiple different contexts, thresholds in more generic terms. In other words, you can have rather than having thresholds based on volume, you can have thresholds based on number of particles or surface area or whatever's applicable, and then have them as alternatives in legislation. Right? So you can have the same regulatory regime where if you get to this mass threshold or volume threshold, or if you get to this surface area threshold or this number of particle threshold, then the regulation kicks in, but without creating an entire new framework. So what about the next one? What about the fact that we don't know about nanotechnology risks? How can we deal with that? Again, it strikes me that this is part of a more general problem. There's lots of risks we don't fully understand. Nanotechnology is one area we don't fully understand the risks, but there might be more. So in a sense, we need to think about that as a society. How do we want to deal with, if you like, known unknowns? How do we want to deal with risks that we haven't yet quantified, but that we know might be out there in terms of any process? And that's a broader question. That's not just a question about nanotechnology. That's a question we have to answer anyway. And that's really something we should design into all regulation, of thinking about, well, if the risk is not known, do we want to have some sort of precautionary principle? Do you want to have some other principle? I mean, they're sort of big questions, but they don't just need to be answered for nanotech. They need to be answered for everything. Okay, risk assessment protocols. That one's fairly easy because, yes, they need to be amended if they need to be amended. I mean, if they're not dealing with nanotechnology properly, we need to amend the protocols. In other words, the testing procedures we're using to test for toxicity and so forth. But such protocols need to be kept under constant review anyway for a range of reasons. Nanotech might mean we need to change them in one way. New scientific data might mean we need to change them in another way later on. In other words, they're the sorts of things that really should be constantly assessed against new possibilities like nanotech, but well, not so new as we heard this morning, but you get my point, against new types of materials, but also, their ability to test new types of materials, but also more accurate testing techniques and so forth as they're discovered. So really that's a question of constant review, and nanotechnology is merely maybe one circumstance in which they need to be looked at again. What about the fact that nanotechnology often falls into research and development exceptions? I think, again, that's a question beyond the nanotechnology context. In other words, sometimes research and development has risks. It might be slightly different to the risks of large-scale industrial operations with hundreds of thousands of employees, but nevertheless, there are still risks involved in research and development. And we need to think broadly about how we regulate those risks. When do we want research and development? What sort of warning signs should there be for introducing regulation at that stage? And that, again, is a broader question. Not just about nanotechnology research and development, but about all research and development and what sorts of protocols are appropriate, when should government step in and so forth. So where have I come in all of this? The first point, I guess, is that we need to think about, the first thing is to think about why nanotechnology raises problems, and the Monash report did that, and I went through some examples of that. The next thing is that solutions, when we're designing them, when we're creating legal solutions to these types of problems, shouldn't necessarily be in the form of a nanotechnology act, say, but should be designed to deal with similar problems outside the nanotechnology context. In other words, we should be thinking about why is nanotechnology problematic? Not just thinking what we can do about nanotechnology, but what we can do about similar things that are problematic in the same ways. So in other words, regulating beyond nanotechnology. And the final point is really that I don't think nanotechnology is a useful regulatory category. I think the definition is too fuzzy to make it something we could regulate, even if we otherwise thought that specificity in this context was desirable. So why do I say all of this? Why, is this all obvious? Is this really something new? The first thing is that a lot of the critique about law's so-called inability to keep up with nanotechnology is based on the non-presence of laws about nanotechnology. In other words, people look at different jurisdictions, go, well, there's no Nanotechnology Act here, therefore Australia hasn't dealt with nanotechnology. And my point is simply that that's not necessarily the test. That you can have effective regulation that deals with nanotechnology without having a Nanotechnology Act. The other thing is that a lot of organisations are introducing nano-specific regulation. So there's Europeans are looking at it for cosmetics, for example. There's extra nano-specific regulatory requirements for cosmetics when nanomaterials are used in cosmetics. The EPA in the US is considering something. I don't have that yet. There's a new bill in Canada, Bill C494, that is again nano-specific and looking at regulating nanotechnology. There's discussions in Australia as well about regulating industrial nanotechnology for various purposes. So a lot of what people are looking at when they're thinking about the nano problems I discussed are in terms of what regulation should we have for nanotechnology, whereas I would argue that we should be thinking what regulation should we have for dealing with broadly the types of problems raised by nanotechnology that will work for similar problems coming up in regulation in the future.
Great, Lyria. We have time for a couple of questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? You've given a very comprehensive presentation.
Okay,
Oh.
Hi, Robert. Sorry, I was late. Judith Stones from Auckland University of Technology. I wanted to know, I'm an RFID specialist, but from the keynotes, I wasn't sure. At first I thought, oh, this is nanotechnology. What? And then I saw him present RFID and I thought, oh, actually, maybe I am part. So how do you see that kind of developing in terms of the community understanding what's part of nanotechnology and what's not?
Well, I think that's the very problem.
Oh.
I mean, I guess I completely agree with you that what is nanotechnology and what is not is the problem of nanotechnology legislation.
So how do we go forward?
How do we go forward? I would say we go forward by thinking about, well, RFID raises very specific issues that I'm sure we discussed at length throughout this whole conference, and you know far more about than me, so I'm not going to answer that in such an illustrious company. But I would say that when you're looking at new technologies like that, there are difficulties in trying to define the solution in terms of the technology. In other words, to think about nanotech has lots of applications, it does lots of different things. I don't think people, yes, it's relevant to RFID, yes, it's relevant to health, yes, it's relevant to all these different things. And yes, it raises real legal issues that have to be dealt with. RFID raises further issues beyond just the questions of size of materials, and there's real serious issues with that. But if we're just looking at size of materials, I would say that we can deal with those issues without mentioning the word nanotechnology.
Thank you for that.
I had a separate question. Obviously, politicians like certainty, and if somebody, for example, if there's a drive time radio show that talks about the dangers of technology, then people will feel comforted if they hear that their politician is going to introduce a law around nanotechnology, which is dangerous or
Yep.
of course of concern. So what sort of response do you think you'll get from regulators on this idea that they actually need to dig a bit deeper and not go for something that's just maybe simple, like let's ban or let's allow nanotechnology?
I actually think that my point about as soon as you try to become specific, you do get all of those, this is what I said about political distortion, right? That you get this sort of simplistic, oh, we'll just ban that because that's sort of too scary, or the alternative of, you know, we should allow this because it's a great economic boon and not think about the risk. So in other words, you get more of that when you talk about nanotechnology. The way I would reply to it if I was answering the drive time question of we need to regulate nanotechnology is I would say no, we need to think about what the issues are, why, in what circumstances is this not already being regulated, and fix legislation to make sure that we're happy with the way it is regulated, but there's not necessarily a need to have laws drafted in terms of nanotechnology. Now, that might be a bit complicated for your average drive-by, talkback radio. But I guess that would be my point. In other words, that we need to make sure that our regulatory system can deal with nanotechnology. But that's not necessarily the same thing as having laws about nanotechnology.
Right. Oh, sorry, one other question. Anna.
I find it very interesting you actually looking at the regulation of this whole technology. What about, say, guidelines to start off with before we talk about regulation? So that might, sort of clarify a few things before developing.
I would say that's a separate question. In other words, we have now situations where government steps in and there are regulations around, for example, manufacture of chemicals, and there are other things that are left to industry, right, where there is a range they can operate and encouraged to do, and there are government guidelines, and there's all sorts of different regulatory mechanisms, right, from legislation to agency level regulation through to compulsory type codes of practice that are sort of registered, and if you don't comply there are real consequences, to much more loosely framed sort of guidelines. I think my concerns about what needs to be done are very much based around the legislation, regulation end. In other words, if we're going to have, if we think government should step in X circumstances, there are issues that nanotechnology raises that I went through about how we know when those circumstances have come up. And nanotechnology is really raising dilemmas for people in that area. In terms of, you know, the sort of things that practice sort of guidelines, you know, industrial manuals for a particular company and so forth deal with, that will obviously inevitably be quite specific. You know, it might be, you know, when employees open the box with these chemicals, they have to use a particular kind of glove. I don't know, I mean, all sorts of things can be done in that kind of context. And I certainly think that that type of informal regulation has an important place. My concern is that in meeting the gaps, if you like, surrounding regulation of nanotechnology at the top level, what we're seeing internationally is nano-specific legislation. Whereas I actually agree with you that a lot of the specific stuff about specific things that rise with specific chemicals and so forth can be dealt with in practice guidelines. But we still need to think about, well, when does the government step in? And that comes into the discussion I was having around volume thresholds, around when something is the same and when it's different.
Okay, thank you very much, Lyria.
Thank you.